I will meet. Yeah, and I have some background noise. So I will.
Yeah, it's not bad. It's just
No, but thank you for the reminder, because I actually do want to mute. Just there is a little bit of noise, so sorry for that.
Welcome to the Disruptive Innovation Festival, and thank you for joining this headline act. The Disruptive Innovation Festival is an online, open access event that invites thought leaders, entrepreneurs, businesses, designers, makers, and learners to explore the question, the economy is changing, what do I need to know, experience, and do? My name's Joe Isles, and I'm delighted to be able to host today's session and to be joined by some expert guests for this headline act. But just before we kick off the session, I want to remind you that the Disruptive Innovation Festival is a truly interactive event. We want to hear your thoughts, your questions, comments, feedback throughout the session, and there are a few ways that you can do that. So the best way perhaps is the comments section below the video that you're watching this live stream on the Disruptive Innovation Festival website. Add your comments in there, and our team will get to them, and we'll put them to our expert panel today. You can also click Be Part of the Conversation within the video player window. If you've got a Google Plus account, this will let you open up the live stream in Google Hangouts, and then you can use the Q&A app to ask questions, and we'll be able to see them on the screen. You can also keep up with the conversation and add your comments on Twitter. We use #ThinkDiff, or @ThinkDiff_ is the Disruptive Innovation Festival HQ handle. And I've had the pleasure of speaking to this panel a number of times over the past few weeks. They're pretty bored of talking to me, and I know that they're going to want to hear from you. So do get your questions in as they come to you, and we'll ask them throughout this session, which will be a discussion. So earlier this year, the popular website TechCrunch reached out to their readers to help them rename a category that had formerly been known as the collaborative consumption or sharing economy category, and it was stories about companies like Airbnb, Uber, Postmates, TaskRabbit, and Handy. They suggested things like on-demand or COCO, collaborative consumption, or sharing is caring. And I found some of the suggestions that the readers of TechCrunch submitted quite interesting. They said the convenience economy, the consumer provider marketplace, global scale middlemen, devolved economy, platform companies, collaborative commerce, or perhaps one of the most cynical of them, the please give us venture capital category. And from this feedback and this kind of interaction from a publication like TechCrunch, I thought it's really clear that the sharing economy movement, if we agree that sharing economy is a term that is useful, and if we agree that it's a cohesive movement at all, is really undergoing a period of splintering, of redefinition, and is still disrupting life as we know it in many areas. So to help us make sense of all this change, what it means, and give us an idea of where it might be heading, we have three leading thinkers on this subject joining us today at the Disruptive Innovation Festival. I'm not going to spend too long on the intros, as I could probably fill the whole hour talking about each of them, and I'd much rather get on to some discussion. They've all just got off long-haul flights. They were just telling me to between 10 and 20 hours of traveling each from our panelists. But Michelle Bowens has actually said that this tiredness could lead to heroic things. That is a quote, actually. So we'll see what happens. April Rinn is expert on the sharing economy and shareable cities. She advises companies, local and national governments, entrepreneurs, think tanks, investors, and development banks working across the for-profit and non-profit models. Neil Gorenflo is the co-founder of Shareable, a non-profit that publishes leading blog posts about sharing and convenes the Sharing Cities global network. And Michelle Bowens is one of the pioneers of the peer-to-peer movements. He's founder and director of the Peer-to-Peer Foundation that works to lay the conceptual foundations of a production system that would serve as an alternative to industrial capitalism. I've really been looking forward to this one. We're going to get stuck into the discussion, and do remember to add your own questions and comments using the methods that I just described. So to kick things off, I'm going to ask each of you a kind of opening question to get your thoughts on the subject at hand. So Michelle, many have said that this so-called sharing economy hasn't actually offered benefit for the many. It maybe hasn't lived up to its initial promise. Do you agree with that? And what would need to change to enable it to realize this potential?
Yeah, well, very much so. Let me briefly say that, when I use peer-to-peer, what I mean is that we live in an epoch where people can connect with each other, self-organize, and create value together. And it takes two main forms. One is the commons form, where people create shared resources like in free software and open design. And the other form, which is what I think is meant by the sharing economy, is then you allow people to exchange. So they're not the same, because in the second form, we're basically exchanging value person to person, and it's usually a market form. And it has the general problem that markets have, which is they do a lot of things good, but you can't really trust them to think beyond the self-interest of the players involved. And I think this is very much the case in what we call the sharing economy. And so we have a choice basically between saying, okay, let the market drive society and just follow whatever happens, or say, no, market should be embedded in society. Now, the key problem with the sharing economy, and that, understood as I just explained it, as this allowing people to exchange with each other, is that we have some kind of a value crisis. And let me explain what I mean. It's very visible when you look at Facebook and Google and YouTube. These companies are no longer producing anything. They're allowing us to exchange communication, documents, videos. So an empty platform is valueless. We clearly co-create the value, and yet 100% of the exchange value is captured by these platform owners. Now, it's a little bit better with Airbnb and Uber because they actually pay people. But think about the negatives. One of the negatives is that what they actually do is atomize people in a way, right? They're not creating a commons. They are usually designed so that the people who supply the service don't actually have a direct contact with the demand side. And so through their algorithm, they govern the market. So it's not just reflecting the market, they're active market makers. And we know stories, for example, where they slow down the adoption of new drivers so that they can apply surge pricing. So they're actively manipulating the markets. We also know, that they are increasing precarity because even though they help people create an extra income, which is as such a good thing, they do that without taking into account, the risks that are involved in having a life like that, right? So they're co-creating a society based on precarity. And finally, think about what Airbnb is doing to cities like San Francisco, which is, even if it's a good thing by itself, there's collateral damage, which means the rents go up and poor people are driven out of the city. So it's just to show you that we can just say, oh, great, this is a great thing, and then society just lets everything go on its own. I think we need to actively think about both the positives and the negatives in these new forms.
Thanks, Michel. I know we're going to come back to some of those topics that you brought up, but that's definitely got us off to a good start. April, what's your take on this overarching question, whether something needs to change for some of these models to start providing more value, or maybe what's your take on the situation as it stands now?
Sure, Joe. Thanks. It's a great opening question, and I'm delighted to be here and looking forward to this hour together. So by and large, I very much echo what Michel has to say, with a couple of caveats, I think. One is, I don't think that anyone ever professed that the sharing economy was a panacea. I don't think that anyone ever said, this is the holy grail, this is the answer, this is going to solve all our problems. So to some degree, I think we're setting almost an impossibly high standard to say that this particular way of looking at the world is going to involve everybody, that it is going to, be everything to everyone. I look at this in a way, I guess you could say pragmatically, and I'm looking for business models that work better for more people. And do I think that the sharing economy overall is an improvement on what was there before? Yes, I do. Do I think that it has reached its full potential? Absolutely not. Far from it, actually. But I just want to call that out. And then I also want to call out the other caveat being language, where the sharing economy is a very imperfect term. And another one of our colleagues, Lisa Gansky, earlier this year wrote a really great piece on how the sharing economy, terminology-wise, is kind of in its adolescence, where we're out of infancy, but it's kind of like trying on a bunch of different clothes and seeing which one fits best, whether it's the sharing economy or collaborative economy or on-demand economy or access economy or you name it. All of those terms are to some degree appropriate. None of them are perfect. And so I think that we're going to take some time figuring all of this out, and ultimately, as I think all of us here would hopefully support, ultimately this just becomes part of the economy. But right now we're kind of fumbling with language and coming up with a hodgepodge of terms, all of which work partially well. Now, when it comes to what needs to change for the sharing economy potentially to reach its full impact and its full benefit, I could talk about these topics all day, but I highlighted, in my mind, I'll just mention 5 things, very big picture. The first one of which Michelle already touched upon, which is we do need new business models in this space. Right now, we're kind of stuck in one of 3 straitjackets. One being a for-profit model, which has lots of shortcomings, largely who can participate in the upside, who can be investors and owners. I'd love to see more platforms that are participant-led or participant-enabled. We either have for-profit, non-profit, which often has challenges with financial sustainability, and then a cooperative model, which actually has a lot of benefits, but thus far in history, we do have some robust examples, but we also have a lot of challenges around governance and whatnot. And ultimately, I think we do have these 3 models. All of them have some merit, some benefit, but I think we're not being creative enough when it comes to new business models that have yet to be developed, that could be some combination, in my opinion, of the for-profit and cooperative model, where we actually have greater worker or participant participation, but also an ability to take different kinds of funding and that sort of thing. So I know I don't have that much time, so I'll go quickly through my points. The first one being new business models. The second one being new policies. And there's a huge opportunity and need here for policymakers to play a greater role in establishing rules that are updated to the reality of the new business models that are possible today. And I will simply mention that policy can really help good business models scale. It can both incentivize the kinds of activity that we want to see and disincentivize the kinds of activity that we don't want to see. And there's an opportunity to do both here. And that could include things like passing rules for new business models, but also regulating and mitigating some of the activity that's happening so that we are promoting, I think home sharing or the likes of Airbnb is a wonderful example, where there are lots of advantages of doing that, but also challenges in particular where there are cases where housing is at a shortage and whatnot. And ironically or coincidentally, I'll just mention briefly, I am actually at the annual host convening for Airbnb hosts. It's called Airbnb Open. And just today, the company announced what they're calling a community compact. And they have committed to working with policymakers in cities where affordable housing supply is at a critical shortage. They are committed to not being part of that problem, but actually working with regulators to take some listings down, manage and monitor the stock more actively, that sort of thing. So I say new policies, but also I think the companies themselves do have an important role that they can play in that. Thirdly, I think that we need more education in this space, and I say education across the board, but in particular, and given that people on this webinar are interested in issues around sustainability, I continue to be amazed in a disappointing way by how few people are actively factoring in sustainability to their decisions about the sharing economy. And so I think there's just a huge opportunity to do much more education and awareness building, both of private sector individuals as well as governments and policymakers. Fourth, I think there is a huge opportunity, again looking at sustainability, to focus on outreach to developing countries and emerging markets. Again, for the sharing economy to reach its full potential, we need to actually be involving and including people everywhere, regardless of where they may fit on the economic pyramid, regardless of whether they're in a big city or a smaller city, that sort of thing. Again, huge opportunity that I believe we've barely tapped the surface of. And finally, this goes a little bit beyond the sharing economy, for sure, but I actually think that there's a huge role here for the sharing economy to reach its full benefit, to spend more time investigating the power of new kinds of decentralized networks and mechanisms of building trust. And in particular, I'll just call out the blockchain and looking at what the blockchain might actually bring to tackle some of the issues that we've seen around trust, around peer credibility, but also around economic efficiency. So that's not a complete list of what needs to happen for the sharing economy to reach its full potential, but those are some of my starting thoughts.
Thanks, April. And in what I think is a Disruptive Innovation Festival first, we've got Michelle actually hopped into the comments on the diff page to offer some feedback, which we will come to. Some good comments on your kind of opening piece there, and just a reminder to everyone watching online: use that comment section below the video of the live stream to add your own comments and questions. We would love to hear them. Neil, so we had some talk of new business models there. I know that's something that you've been writing about, talking about, working on, especially recently with a recent piece on Shareable. What's your take on this question? What does need to change for sharing economy models, some of these new business models, to offer greater benefit?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's clear that you know, the focus point of the discussion within the sharing economy, within people very interested and concerned, has really turned to this idea of you know, who owns and makes the decisions within the platforms, and how can we better align who creates the value and with who decides and who benefits the most. And so we kind of have a sort of counter movement brewing. This weekend is a conference called Platform Cooperativism. It's kind of a mouthful, but the basic idea is you know, sharing economy meets co-ops, but co-ops, I would say, not in the legal sense, but in the ownership and decision-making dynamics. So, you know, imagine an Airbnb where the hosts and the users, and the host and the guests are actually the owners and decision makers. They have an active say and maybe even shares in the platform. I think also that, and others have, you know, made this observation as well, is that might become a competitive necessity. Maybe the next generation coming up will have to do this to attract and keep you know, providers and users, as other advantages are wrung out, you know, through marketplace dynamics. So I think on the one hand there is a kind of utopian impulse. On the other hand, I think there are some very serious economic drivers that would lead naturally to this this kind of dynamic. So I'm really hopeful about this. We broke the story on platform co-ops last year in a piece called "Owning is the New Sharing," and it lists many examples of how this is unfolding, and it's not just an idea. I mean, people are doing it. There are, for instance, April mentioned the blockchain. There's a blockchain version of Uber called Lazuz. I'm just putting the article in the chat window. And Lazuz works like this: is you mine coins by giving rides. So it's using the same kind of technology and dynamics as Bitcoin, but for to manage a marketplace for rides. So that's really interesting. And then there's an Oakland nonprofit that's in development, going to be launching I hear in a couple of weeks. That's actually a T Corp. It's an actual T Corp, or a cooperative version, in the legal sense, version of TaskRabbit. And then another form that I see with lots of possibilities and could, you know, take many forms, a kind of hybrid form is you know, an example of it is Inspiral Network. which is a collection of freelancers and social enterprises that operate kind of as one entity, even though legally they're distinct. They have a stake in what happens with the collective, and there are a lot of ways that they create mutual benefit, and they leverage digital technologies and community, to generate and create these kind of cooperative dynamics. So it's that I think there is a kind of many possibilities that you can use digital technology to share decision making, share ownership. Those are the three basic patterns I see now, and also I think the question has to be clearly like not what needs to happen so that the sharing economy is benefit. Any economy, the question really is how does it, the economy isn't an end in itself. It's a means to an end. And I feel like in general, even beyond the sharing economy, we lose sight of this. There should be more dialogue about what kind of society we want, what kind of lives and communities we want, and then we design backwards from that. And there's not enough of that discussion within the sharing economy. I think that there are huge liberatory and sustainability potential with the sharing economy, but it has to be actively shaped for that. And the existing players, they're not going to do it. The pattern is set. The stakeholders they must serve, Airbnb and Uber, are venture capitalists. They call the shots, and it's not the mission of these companies to deliver on social mission. That's just not what they do. They're not designed to do that. We should not expect them to do that. And so we need to create policies in cities and also enterprises that can get us the kind of results that we want.
Thanks, Neil. We've actually loads of those points that you've made have been popping up in they're in some of my questions I had in preparing for this session. But also, Michelle, you've been live commenting in the comments window below the video. Since we've got you here, why don't you put some of these comments to the rest of the panel? I just wanted to pick up on your comment about policy. Could you elaborate on the comment that you put in the comments, and maybe ask April the question around protecting the big players against disruption?
Right. Well, so I think April and me, we share the opinion that we do need policy. Of course, the big question is what kind of policy. And what we have seen in a lot of places is a policy that is exclusively designed to protect the incumbents, which in this case is the taxi industry and the taxi workers. And that, of course, I can see the justification for that from a certain perspective. But I think that these peer-to-peer dynamics of ride-sharing and ride-hailing bring something new that is really very important for society, which is the reuse of vital resources, right? And in some way, then we have this conflict between the old workers from the 19th and 20th century against the new precarious workers who work for Airbnb and Uber, and they're kind of pitted against each other. So I think what I would like to say is, this kind of policy that I would favor is a policy that protects the workers within Uber and Airbnb and the consumers and users of these platforms. And another aspect that I would think is very important is the protection of local diversity and against monopolism, because that's a really big danger. All these players are actually actively losing money, and they do that on purpose because they want to be the master of a global market. And so we're going to have these few players, like we already have Google and Facebook, that dominate an entire industry. And I think this is not healthy. So Neil can correct me, but I heard that when Seoul prohibited Uber, it was actually not just to protect the taxis, it was to make sure that there could be a local sharing economy, that they could have developed their local applications. Because having Airbnb and Uber in your city is a bit like having a supermarket. And studies show that about 30% of the local economic flow actually leaves the region and goes somewhere else. So I think there is, again, there in terms of territorial policy, there is a justified rationale for doing policies that protects diversity in a territory.
Anyone want to come back on that issue around policy?
I'm happy to. Neil,
go for it, April.
Yeah. Okay. Where to start? So I very much, Michelle, largely agree with what you're saying in terms of I am really trying to get as many kinds of business models and participation as possible. So local and global coexisting, it's typically easier said than done. But I will say I have no problem providing preferable or favorable legislation to local companies over global companies. I have a harder time banning global companies outright from a local market because it actually, some of these ideas are actually super helpful to lots of local markets. Now, I'm going to share just actually an example that wouldn't have normally surfaced, but I was in Indonesia last month, right? Not a place I would typically look for sharing economy examples, but there is a company called Gojek, and Gojek is basically Uber on mopeds, and it's locally owned and operated, and it has about 70,000 drivers who wear green jackets and provide helmets to all their passengers and so forth. And I was kind of amazed in the best of ways to learn that, you know, the government there has cracked down pretty hard on Uber, but when it came to regulating Gojek, they were like, well, you know, the benefit is residing to the local economy. These services appear to be complementary. Gojek has largely implemented a robust and credible form of self-regulation, if you will, through the green jackets for identification, the helmets, and so forth. And so they took a really light touch to the local company. Now, we'll see how that plays out over time, but I actually think it's quite telling as to how, you know, I think that some regulation is required, but I don't know that we have to treat necessarily local and global companies exactly alike. That said, you know, I work with companies and local governments in a lot of different places, and I will say it tends to be much, much harder to scale something that is at the local level to go global. And a lot of times that's what platforms want to do. And so there's this tension between, you know, Seoul has done a wonderful job of investing in local companies. And I can't say enough good things about how the effect that that's had to build community and grow local entrepreneurship and so forth. But most of those platforms would like to grow beyond Seoul, beyond South Korea. And they're really having a hard time doing that. And quite candidly, they would still be having a hard time doing that even in the absence of global players. So, you know, it's kind of one of those things where we want to have our cake and eat it too, and that's often quite difficult. One other thing that I will add about policy is that, you know, and this is a slightly different direction, but a lot of people are talking about, you know, we need to level the playing field for policy. And I think that that's not quite the right terminology. I'm not sure that the playing field has ever been level at any point in history. But when we think about policy reform, there are two ways we can think about it. One is removing regulatory barriers that exist currently that no longer serve their original purpose, so making it easier for everyone to participate. And then secondly, creating new and appropriate rules to govern new risks. And so there's kind of a tandem process that goes on where, by and large, even if you ask taxi companies today, they will say they are subject to a lot of regulations that they simply don't need. This adds to their cost structure. This puts them in a much, much tougher position. So they would actually be even more competitive vis-a-vis the newer entrants if some of the regulatory burden was lifted off of them. And we can look at several different pilots and policy processes underway in several different cities. I'll just use the case of Portland, Oregon, where last year they undertook a pilot for ride-sharing companies and taxi companies, so that they all, basically they removed the restrictions on taxis, caps on fares and things like that, set conditions that every single service had to provide, and said at the end of this 4-month pilot, we will develop policies based on who has performed best. And that included things like providing 24/7 access to disabled people, etc. And at the end, there was a clear showing that benefit of the new ride-sharing and ride-hailing companies was there, but also that taxi companies, traditional taxi companies, were not incapable of innovating. And that even there were cases in which taxi companies and ride-sharing or ride-hailing companies could partner together. So I think that this is not a one-size-fits-all solution, and that there are pathways where we can look at incumbent companies not completely going by the wayside, but also providing more room for new entrants to enter. And sort of final closing thought, I will say that people who think that if their company or their technology or their business model has worked for the last 30 years, if there's an assumption that it's going to continue to work in the same fashion for the next 30 years, I think that assumption is wildly misplaced, but that's not because of the sharing economy, that's not because of today's economy, that's throughout the course of history. If you think about if you invested in CD technology, and then that was replaced by MP3s, and that was then replaced by online music streaming, we invest in technologies that then become outdated. We have to think about our business models in that way too.
So we've got some really good questions coming in. I'm going to get to them in just a moment. But Neil, any thoughts on April's piece there? Is this regarding those closing remarks? Is this a case of normal sort of disruption? This sort of thing just goes in cycles.
Well, I think there's something new, a new phenomenon going on, and also I just want to point out that the language used around this, in the press and so forth, that Uber was, that Uber or Airbnb or this or that company was banned by X, Y, or Z company. We really have to kind of take a time out and say that they weren't banned. These cities were trying to enforce their laws. These were illegal activities. And so, saying banned kind of puts a bias to the likes of Airbnb and Uber. That they are victims and in the way of progress. And I think that at least in the case of the flagship sharing economy companies like Uber and Airbnb, they are very aggressively trying to establish global monopolies. This is a kind of shock and awe entrepreneurship where the more money they raise, the more laws they break, the more users they get, and the more users they get, the more money they can raise and expand. And the press feeds into this in an incredible way as well. And so. And the language of some of the major investors too is really interesting to look at. That shows that there is a kind of new aggressive attitude, a new imperialistic almost attitude. Like Peter Thiel saying, in a Wall Street Journal op-ed, competition is for losers, right? Urging entrepreneurs to create monopolies. And Mark Andreessen, also a sharing economy investor, saying software is eating the world, but it's his software that's eating the world. It's not our software eating the world. So this is a battle. This is and civil society citizens, should be alert and should be on their local authorities to make sure that these regulations serve the public interest. I mean, in the case of Portland, there's this a really eye-opening article about how Uber strong-armed the mayor of Portland to get a shot at a favorable regulation. That's how they got that pilot going. They literally besieged Portland and put the mayor in a position where he had to act and put Uber's agenda in front of everyone else's existing sort of issues. So I really don't think this is a kind of neutral, thing. There's something else more powerful at work. I outlined this in a feature story that's like over 8,000 people have read so far. about platform cooperatives, and I'll put it in the chat window. How platform co-ops can beat Death Stars like Uber to create a real sharing economy.
Thanks, Neil. Yeah, I read that article earlier this week. I recommend that you do the same. It is an eye opener. I just want to step back for a moment. We've had a question in from the live audience who said, "Don't we need both big, centralized global entities as well as small and local?" And this person has said that ecosystems operate so looking at natural systems, maybe like a forest, a living system, they operate in a similar way. They have many scales. They have big trees in the example of forest, and then all sorts of different organisms operating at different scales. Should our economy look the same? Is this how much of this is a case of big versus small? Because to some listeners, it could sound that way. Michelle, maybe you take that one.
Yeah, this is really a crucial issue, and I think this is really the point, that it's very easy for venture capital to scale because they have all the means at their disposal, but they're scaling through hierarchy and centralized ownership. And these are models really without participation and any democratic governance. In Facebook, you don't decide on the design, you don't own your data, they can kick you out, you don't know how to get back in. So it's kind of a new feudalism that we acquires to, and so I think this is very dangerous. On the other hand, there's a lot of problems of fragmentation in the more ethical models that are taking more account of collaborative practices. I discovered the other day that in the consumer-supported agriculture, just in Italy, they have 13 different ordering systems, for one industry, which is an ethical industry in which consumers and farmers get together. So this is where I think actually cities could play a role as conveners. I see cities as conveners for a more ethical sharing economy, and then they could have city consortiums. So in other words, you could have a ride-hailing app. You don't have to develop it 20 times. It's sufficient to have one. And so if we could have a group of cities together, I'm adamant they wouldn't own it, they wouldn't even direct it. It should be a multi-stakeholder governance model. But they could be conveners, helping citizens coalesce around the building of this sharing economy. And I think it's a question of balance. So yeah, so that's yes, we do need these ecosystems. Maybe I should give you two examples. They're very budding examples, by no means as impressive as Uber and Airbnb in their implementation yet. But I like what's happening in Madison, Wisconsin, with the mutual aid network of Stephanie Rearick, where around the time bank, which really functions there, because it doesn't always function, but there it really works. They're looking at how the time bank can work with a credit union, how the credit union can work with a food co-op, and so creating value streams. And this is not centralized. This is like a coordinating platform. It's really different. And in France, there's a group called En Commun in Lille, in the north of France, where they developed 10 criteria for what they call a common good institution, which looks not just for its own benefit and profit, but looks to the wider society. And they're basically trying to do the same thing. So that's the kind of, I know it's difficult, but I think it has to be done, and that's why I'm very happy with the platform co-op event that's going to take place tomorrow and the 14th, because it's tackling that issue. It's bringing people together from the co-op world, policymakers, citizens, to see if we have another less extractive model than these centralizing monopolies that we are moving towards.
So thank you for that answer. I want to make sure we get through some more of the questions because there's some really good ones coming in. And this one is related. Stephen Glynn has said, is part of the problem that there is this need to scale, maybe the need or desire that April was mentioning in Seoul, And does that relate to dominant views about what business is actually for? Stephen gives a UK co-op example of the Unicorn Grocery in Manchester, which has been very successful on a local level, but rather than looking to expand, they've produced guidance to help other people set up something similar in their own locality. April, does there need to be more of this information about the challenges dominant views about the purpose of business?
Absolutely, actually, and I'm really glad that we're bringing up this question, because on one hand, and it's funny, I actually gave a presentation last week to a group of credit unions about exactly this, looking at just new business models, but also that historically when we think about scale, it's been very much in a kind of top-down, bigger equals better mentality, and that the only way to bigger was through in-house growth. But now we're seeing scale that's achieved through distribution, that's achieved through networks, which is exactly what I think the Unicorn Grocery example gets at, which is we need to seed a network that becomes, you're scaling as much, if not more than, one centralized institution, but you're doing so through decentralized nodes in a network. Now the challenge is when people need to, quote unquote, own that most valuable node. That has a natural gravitation towards centralization. But on balance, I think that yes, if we can get to the point where it's much more about these decentralized networks of nodes, each of which contains some value that either is congruent with the size of a local economy or the size of a particular activity, whatever the case may be, that's actually much more helpful, much more democratic, if you will. The challenge becomes, and I'm just going to sort of call it out, often human ego, where somebody who's building something wants to build it bigger. They want to own, or at least have access to, or have a say over a greater share of that pie. So there's something around psychology and culture that needs to shift as well. And of course we're starting to see shifts around ownership versus access, where people don't feel the same connection that they felt to their car in years past. But when it comes to something that you may have built, be that a platform or some kind of enterprise, sometimes you find that mentality, I don't want to say it breaks down, but it becomes much more challenging to overcome, where if you've built something, you do want to see it grow, and you don't necessarily want to, quote unquote, share that power or that control with others. Now, I think we're gradually shifting to a place where that's less of a challenge for more people, but it's not an overnight thing. So, I kind of don't know how far we can push that discussion on this call, or we could probably talk about it for the rest of the time, but I'm not sure if we would land anywhere specific. The one other thing I do want to call out here, which is related to monopolies, is quite interesting, actually. There's another related question in the chat around, isn't there a natural tendency towards monopolies? As these are all network solutions, don't they tend to become monopolies? Not necessarily. I mean, it really depends on the geographic, among other things, it depends on the geographic scope of what you're trying to share. And I think it's a really interesting contrast to make here. For example, a car sharing network is likely going to be as big as the community that it seeks to serve. So that might be as big as a city where I'm not going to share my car with somebody who's in another state. But if I'm traveling to another state, then yes, I would want the network to operate there, for example. The interesting thing about Airbnb is the very nature of that platform is to travel somewhere else and share some space when you're there. You wouldn't share in your own city. So by its nature, it has this global effect because of the asset that's in use. Versus if we look at something like a tool sharing library, which is one of my favorite models, I'm not going to share a blender or a lawnmower with somebody who lives 200 miles away. It makes no sense for me to do that. So the tool library, it tends to be much more local because of not just the transaction costs, but the geolocation of what it is that I need to share. So I call that out because it's an interesting filter to apply to some of this. And it also, one final very small point, but I do think it's interesting, at least in the US context, where to some degree, some people would say that, at least there's been an ability to play Uber and Lyft off of one another, some kind of competition at least in terms of consumer choice. In the case of Airbnb, it's interesting. I can't say that the company's goal was to be a monopoly, but largely that's been the result. And how do you think about regulation in the case where there is competition or there isn't competition? It may look and feel quite different.
So Neil, we've just
Yeah.
had to switch computers here with just a bit of.
I know. I saw you disappear there, Joe. I was like, oh, where did Joe go?
No, I'm still here, but we're running
Okay.
around our studio frantically. Neil, I want to pick up on a question. Ego was brought up then, and this idea of scale. How much of platform co-ops and this different model that you've described, how much of it depends on altruism, so and an understanding of an awareness of the greater sort of vision or common good, because sometimes that seems like it's not the first option in a capitalist society.
Yeah, I mean, the early adopters, the moral imperative is important, but after that, you know, it becomes less and less a concern for other adopter types. So, but I would say that it's not reliant on a kind of idealistic attitude to scale. I think actually what it can do is better align self-interest and common good. I think what's required is some open-mindedness and willingness to experiment and not drink the Silicon Valley Kool-Aid that there's only one way to create an economy or scale a business. You know, this is ridiculous. It's a kind of monoculture of ideas here. We all seem to be kind of seduced by it. And just to go back to the co-op thing about scale and how can the little guy or compete. I mean, there are various regions around the world where small to medium-sized cooperatives form in networks to compete with global players. You know, Emilia-Romagna in Italy, Montreal, in Canada, and then Mondragon in Spain. So this is the principle 6 of the Rochdale principles is that co-ops are supposed to cooperate with one another, and I think that platform co-ops can do the same and even take cooperation to the next level and share code and IP and knowledge and policy and much more.
Thanks, Neil. I'm just going to come back to a couple of the questions we've got coming in. So one from the chat. Someone said, this is tangential and may not be something you want to address now, but do you see a complementary role for money-free time banking? Can sharing economy work with time banking to mutual benefit? Michelle, can you comment on that, and maybe more generally on the role of money in this in a peer-to-peer sense?
I would say yes and no. I think in general, what we need is monetary biodiversity or monetary diversity. So we have national currencies, and I don't think they will disappear anytime soon. They're still very important. We have lots of local complementary currencies, but they tend not to be that strong. And I think what we'll need also is what I call virtual affinity-based currencies, and they don't really exist yet, except like things like Sardex in Sardinia and the Weir in Switzerland, which is like mutual credit systems that are supported by alliances of small businesses. So I think in general, the sharing economy that we talk about here is, of course, in a way misnamed because people are actually selling and renting their stuff, and so we can question whether that is a sharing economy. It's more like, they're trying to find new names, as April said, like on-demand economy and another word. But of course, there is another sharing economy where people are actually, have a different vision about sharing, and they get occluded by the press coverage of the big monopolies. Now, I want to make a little remark, and that remark is on power. That's the whole thing about the local and the global is about power. So here's my argument. In a certain way, today with the networks, everything we do locally is also global, right? Ezio Manzini says small, local, open, and connected. So today you do something, you're networked, you are global. But there's a question of power. So imagine this scenario: you have a fishery commons. All the fishermen get together, beautiful bay. They make an agreement. But just outside your 12-mile zone, that you have these industrial fishing ships sucking out all the fish anyway. So we can't just be happy with the local. We have to tackle global imbalances in power and privilege. And the local just alone just doesn't cut it. So that's why I'm so hot on you know global business ecosystems. So it's not about centralizing under one ownership. It's people getting together who do the same thing and creating coordinating mechanisms. Um, and Spiral, it started in New Zealand, 50 members last year, 250 this year, and I'm an honorary member now, and I'm pretty sure they will expand. And so this is what we need: people that are locally rooted, but they're globally coordinating their activities, and they have a sense that there is politics and policy. So then they need to defend and expand their capability of growing the share economy. And that requires people working together just beyond the local scale. I want to insist on that.
Another question that's come through relates to this point about different about ego and power and scale, and it's around B Corps. So this is something that's relatively recent emergence, and companies like Unilever stating they'd like to, they're aware and would like to change the way they operate to offer greater benefits. So the question is, the B Corporation is an interesting legal structure for private sector organizations, with companies like Unilever heading towards taking on these new structures. Do you feel that the private sector is being disrupted by these new structures, April?
That's another great question. And I am a big advocate of B Corps, and actually many measures that raise the bar for the kinds of standards and returns and metrics that companies are asked to track, going far beyond finance to looking at environmental returns, social returns, etc. I'm not sure that we're at a point yet where things like B Corp status would have, in my opinion, that it's disrupting things. When I think of disrupting, it's like, oh my goodness, this may threaten our very existence. Now, candidly, in the case of B Corps, I would love to get to that point. I would love to see a world in which the only companies that matter are B Corps, or any company that's worth any value at all is a B Corp and is not just talking the talk, but really walking the walk. That said, in the last 2, 3, 5 years, we've seen a significant uptick in activity. So I think we may be in the early stages of something that becomes much more disruptive. And it's great to see the likes of Unilever and Patagonia and so forth adopting these principles. But if I see Google become a B Corp, then that will send a very different signal. I do think, though, that the kinds of companies that we see paying attention to this, starting the process of going to become a B Corp and that kind of thing, is quite interesting. And I'm actually, it ties together a lot of different threads, because I think that there are many different ways we can look at how outdated our system of tracking value and well-being is, and historically looking at financial returns. And if you take the sharing economy, we could also talk about how it's disrupting things like GDP, and it's disrupting traditional metrics of measuring health and productivity and that sort of thing. And I will admit that I really like the fact that we're starting to crack open some of these much bigger, much thornier issues around how we have developed an economic system that really doesn't work for most people, but also that's tracking the wrong things. We're paying too much attention to metrics that have really outlasted their useful life, and yet meanwhile we're not tracking metrics that really do get much more at the core of what's going on. So that goes beyond B Corps, but I do think should be factored into a conversation like this.
Thanks. I want to. I mean, that is quite a, I guess, quite a practical way forward that is happening now. I want to end, perhaps, well, we've got 5 minutes left, with a couple more of these, perhaps, practical or tangible ways forward. There are some questions coming in, quite specific points that people are picking up on from our discussion. You guys are multitasking like absolute demons, commenting in the discussion underneath the video whilst participating in the discussion here. So perhaps you can answer some of those requests for information in the discussion, typing the answers. But in terms of the questions from the audience, so Jean-Pierre has asked, what framework for public governance towards social progress do you think matches good for the work of planning and managing sharing cities? Neil, I'm going to come to you with that one, obviously, with the shareable cities work that you've done.
Yeah, that's funny. Well, great question, and also relevant because Michelle and I are just back from a conference in Bologna called City as a Commons. And you know, it's really interesting, and this conference did a very, I think, bold turn, you know, moving from thinking about the urban commons within a city to think about the entire city as a commons, and to kind of make a claim on the city for people. So over corporations and other, you know, and other interests, and you know, even traditional government. So you know, I think that the commons has a lot of potential. I wouldn't go so far as like to think of every aspect of a city, every aspect of its economy and governance being a commons. I think a better or maybe a more resilient approach would be that there is a diversity of ways to create and exchange value. But that the commons gets more precedent, much more focused than it does now. That it is already rising in importance in multiple ways. That, you know, this is one of the things, you know, Michelle touched on this, is that you know, there is the Airbnb and Uber that get all the headlines, you know, but in the background there is a global movement of urban commons, of people with, you know, forming time banks and tool libraries and co-working spaces and hacker spaces and fab labs and repair cafes, you know, and the list goes on, you know, little free libraries. I mean, and these operate in a different way. You know, they don't get the headlines because they instead of having their impact through scale, they have their impact through replication. People see something that works, that delivers value, and they see it on the internet, and it's explained or is clear enough, or there's a how-to, and then you can replicate that in your community. I mean, we on Shareable, we have a sharing how-to guide to establish a lot of those things. I'll put that in the chat window, and this type of this movement, this grassroots sort of movement, needs more attention, more resources, and more consideration by governments, by cities, to foster it and make it, you know, realize its potential to deliver better quality of life for people.
Thanks, Neil. I'm going to squeeze in a question here about. We really picked up on a point that Michelle, you've actually put in one of the first ones you put in the comments earlier on, and it's about resources and energy. So obviously, at the Ellen MacArthur Foundation, one of our interests in some of these shared use schemes, or more greater productivity from things like cars and bikes and homes. One of the interests is resources and energy. And earlier on, Michelle, you mentioned about the Jevons effect. Do you think you could explain a little bit about why you mentioned that and what it means and is significant?
Well, the Jevons effect is, you know, it's I don't know who Jevons was, but he used an example of light bulb. If you make light bulbs more efficient, you would say, oh, that's great, you know, now we don't have to use as much electricity. But the actual result is that people then start putting more lights everywhere, so you're back at square one. And the same has been noted with car sharing, which in theory one shared car can replace 12 private cars. But we have also seen that people who didn't drive cars but were using public transport switched to cars through car sharing. So any measure taken in isolation is never going to be enough. It really needs to be a systemic, integrated approach. And I'd like to make a little remark, if I have the time, which is very important for the Ellen MacArthur Foundation, around the circular economy. We need a whole open source stack. We need communities to do design that is not meant for artificial scarcity and planned obsolescence. And then we need businesses to make and sell those things. We need to share the logistics. We need open supply chains and open logistics and open book accounting. Because how can you have a circular economy if companies are not sharing their supply chains? It's not going to happen. So this kind of openness and sharing is not just a luxury. It's really part of this integrated approach that we need to take for transition. And that's also what our project, commonstransition.org, is about, is to develop integrated policies. We tried in Ecuador. It wasn't a huge success there. But I think, in terms of thinking through the process, we were achieved quite a bit. And now we are talking to various players and giving workshops about city transitions that is very complementary with the work that April and Neil is doing.
I think that's a great point, and it's great to see that more people are reinstating this need for more openness. We had Open Source Circular Economy doing a session earlier on at the Disruptive Innovation Festival, which really spoke to your point. The last question I'm going to ask, and I'm going to need some pretty snappy answers from all of you, is, so obviously we've had a great discussion, but there's people watching who are maybe wondering what this all kind of means for them. So what advice would you give to people of how they can participate in this in this shift, be part of this transition, perhaps, if I dare say, in the right way? Because there are some practices that we're all going about. In your recent article, Neil, you said you use some of these Death Star models as well.
Yeah, sure.
How can we participate in a way that that supports some of the change that we've all been talking about today? April, do you want to kick it off?
Sure, and I'll try to keep it brief. And I do want to just put one footnote and say, huge fan of Michel's work that he's done in Ecuador and elsewhere, and it's something that we all need to be paying attention to. I think Ecuador was a great first case, but we're going to see more progress in the future. So, total fan of that kind of initiative. I think the number one thing is to be aware and do research on the business models and platforms that you're using, and recognize that there are all kinds of different benefits: economic, environmental, community, convenience, all of that. Again, no model that I've come across yet makes everyone happy about everything. But if you really are more focused on building community, well then make sure that the DNA of the companies that you're using, the platforms you're participating on, reflect those values. If they're not, go start another platform that does, or simply refrain from that kind of activity. But I think there's a certain amount of onus or responsibility on the participants, as well as then I think there's a huge responsibility on the companies and the policymakers, but here I'm focusing on the individuals. So do your homework, be aware, support those platforms that really, or as I like to say, favor those platforms that favor community, or that favor your values, or that favor your set of priorities.
Neil, what do you think?
Yeah, so two things. Like first is, I think I'm a real big advocate of integrating sharing into your everyday life, and the kind of sharing that builds relationships and enduring social ties. And I did an experiment and I called it the Year of Living Shareably, and I blogged about. I did about 30 different experiments. When I totaled everything up, I saved $17,000 for our family through sharing, So there's a really powerful bottom line that you can get out of it. But the most valuable thing was the relationships that I built. One of the coolest things we did was a child care co-op with our neighbors. You know, I have a 6-year-old son, so at the time we got a couple of other neighbors together and had you know, collectivized our child care. And you know, now my son has two sisters, and we're woven together with these 2 other families, plus some other families that participated, you know, on a smaller scale with us. So it was really an amazing and powerful experience. And then the second thing I would add is, like, get involved in, you know, be a active citizen, you know, get involved in your local politics and these issues, and shape the laws that are good for you, you know, good for you and your family and for communities. You know, that's a kind of basic. So yeah, that's my take.
Thanks. And finally, Michel.
Yeah, well, here's the good news. There's a Dutch statistic that shows that since 2005, there's an exponential rise in non-state and non-corporate initiatives. So citizens are moving. Now, what we need is, in my view, we need 3 criteria: free, fair, and sustainable. Free means sharing knowledge, eventually mutualizing infrastructure. Fair means we need models that, you know, just don't suck the value only to a tiny minority of shareholders, but really broadly share the benefits and the profits to a wider population. And sustainable, you know, ecologically sustainable. Now, just to conclude, from the very personal point of view, here's what I recommend, and it's what I did with my life. First, you know, follow your passion. It's the only way to be happy is to follow your passion. So this is first. Second, develop your skills, because if you have a passion and you don't have skills, then who cares about your passion? And the third thing is social need. You know, who can you help with this combination? And so you create a community, you create a commons around your shared passion. That creates an economy around it. And so this is how, in my view, we create a really sharing economy from the bottom up rather than from the top down.
Thank you, Michel. I've had a fantastic time talking with you all. A lot of this change, I mean, the impression I'm getting is that a lot of this change is good or has the potential to be good and positive, but really awareness of the change that's taking place is important, and it's really up to everyone, the users, policymakers, businesses, to understand the vision, understand the journey, and actively participate in where this is going, rather than following on the path set by headlines and perhaps by the mass public. So thank you all for taking the time. I know you've been on flights around the world. You're coming across. April, you said we were on 17 time zones, different time zones. I don't know if that's true. We're definitely in 4 different continents. So thank you so much for taking part. I've had a fantastic time talking to you. For those of you watching online, we're actually going to try something a bit different following this headline act. As soon as this finishes, we're going to head over to Blab. It's a platform for conversation, live video conversation that we've been experimenting with at this year's DIF. Here's how it works. You download the Blab app to your mobile device or visit blab.im in a browser. You can watch the discussion, but if you sign in with a Twitter account, that's when it gets really interesting. You can ask questions, or you can come on live using your phone or webcam and mic to continue the discussion. So we'll hang around on there for a few more minutes, maybe answer some of these unanswered questions and hear your views on the session that we've just had. But for now, thank you, April, Michel, and Neil, for a fantastic discussion, and hopefully we'll see you again soon.
Thanks, Joe.
Bye.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks. It will be a pleasure and an honor. Thank you.
Bye-bye.